this notion of DEI has essentially infiltrated its way into every institution. It's leading to perversion, and I think it's leading to delusion. This is collective madness. People have lost their minds. People are trying to essentially justify and encourage paedophilia. They say that these people are just attracted to children. Mark, the lunatics are running the asylum.
James, what's your reaction to the National Police Chiefs Council suggesting, well, in fact, recommending that trans women police officers who have a gender recognition certificate should be allowed to strip search female prisoners, something I gather the British Transport Police, no pun intended, have already awarded themselves. I mean, what's going on here and what's your reaction to all that?
I think it's a complete and utter outrage. I mean, it flies in the face of decency and dignity. You know, we have same-sex sensitive care, if we're going to use that term, provision for a reason. And now to suggest that because somebody has a piece of paper or because they have come up with some self-identified label, that in some way makes it all right for men to be involved in sensitive care or sensitive searching of women, often very vulnerable women, I think is an utter disgrace. I mean, it demonstrates the way in which this ideology is seeped into all of our societal institutions. I mean, one might have hoped that the police, above all else, could have been free from this, but it's just as bad there as it is anywhere else. And I've seen similar talk in NHS institutions, you know, saying that women who request a female sensitive care provider, that if they've got a doctor who is male but identifies as a woman, that they should essentially have to suck it up, and if they don't, that they're in some ways bigoted or transphobic for wanting that. I think we've truly lost the plot.
It is extraordinary, isn't it? Because it's not just sort of the grotesques you tend to find in organisations like Stonewall and Mermaids, who are advocating what appears to me, and I guess about 80% of the population, to be bizarre and tawdry, immoral. You can use any adjective you want. You've got very mainstream organisations like the police, politicians, mainstream politicians, as in, you know, Scotland or down here, also advocating this. So it seems as this kind of almost weird virus that has taken hold of, you know, ostensibly respectable people and public institutions.
It is, and I say this from a therapeutic perspective, it is collective madness. People have lost their minds. Now, I don't genuinely think everyone actually believes this stuff. I think some people are going along with this because it makes their lives easier. Regardless, the outcome is the same, which is a complete affront to any sense of reality. Institutional neutrality, particularly in the public sector, has completely gone out the window. These are politically based ideologies. And so to see the police, for example, attending pride marches and dancing around with drag queens, or to see NHS trusts flying the pride flag outside hospital buildings as if it has the same status as a national flag, I think it flies in the face of neutrality. And the problem is this notion of DEI has essentially infiltrated its way into every institution. Every organisation is looking to have DEI leads, DEI policies, and all of this stuff falls quite squarely under that framework. I think for an organisation to not have a DEI policy, for example, it would feel these days as if they were missing something, as if there was a part of themselves that had been taken away, because we've got so used to this notion that we all must be kind and inclusive and diverse. So this has essentially become part of the course, and that's why you get the madness that you just described, for example, in the police, because people are not thinking twice about it. As far as they're concerned, they're simply being decent, progressive people in a modern society.
It has this sort of totalitarian feel. So on the one hand, you have this kind of saccharine, maudlin, bland way in which this stuff is sort of presented. So people, the vast majority of people, unless they come across it directly, sort of feel that it's not necessarily political. It's something else. It's more a sort of ill-defined vibe. And yet it's a very profoundly authoritarian movement in this area, but also in terms of the other dimensions of the new left, woke sort of constellation. So there's this strange dichotomy, isn't there, between the atmospherics, the Be Kind posters on London Underground, and yet the hard reality that there are, as you've just said, sort of commissars embedded in all major companies, all public sector institutions, keeping people under surveillance, enforcing this stuff, getting people sacked. I mean, we'll come on to your personal story in a moment. But am I overstating this sort of discrepancy, this disjuncture?
No, this is precisely how they keep people in check. It's a form of public shaming. It's actually very clever, this whole Be Kind piece, because when we think about, I don't know, previous totalitarian or fascist regimes, I don't think that they were trying to pretend that they were necessarily being kind. I mean, they had identified what they saw was a problem in society, and they viewed it as their job to root it out or exterminate it, often using very harsh language. These days, it's covered in rainbows and this notion of we're only doing it, for your own good because it's the kind thing to do. And if you dare to step out of line, well, then that must say that you're not a very kind person. Because, of course, who would be in favour of racism? This is the thing, even the couching of the term anti-racist. It's no longer good enough to simply not be racist. You have to declare your allegiance to this notion of being anti-racist. But it's interesting, the power play, because it's not always necessarily from the top down. So, for example, I recently covered a case of the chief executive of the Royal College for Speech and Language Therapists, and he was essentially hauled over the coals internally because he dared to follow Tommy Robinson on X. He had never liked or amplified anything Robinson had put out. He simply followed him, and some DEI committee at the college found out, and essentially they launched an internal investigation into the CEO, and he ended up having to make a public apology to the entire organisation. So actually, it doesn't really matter whether you're the big guy or the little guy in an organisation. They will come for you regardless if you dare to step out of line.
Yes, I mean, there's this quality. I mean, that story you've just told me, there's a quality here of the sort of Maoist cultural revolution with people having to make apologies simply for looking at stuff, presumably in their own private time, on their own private PCs, away from work. And also, it's interesting. I mean, you referred to sort of fascism, because in the early stages of fascism, apparently the propaganda was very soft focus. I mean, somebody called Walter Benjamin from the Frankfurt School wrote an interesting analysis of what he called the aestheticization of politics, which he claimed was what fascism was about. And the propaganda was all about happy families, the vocal coming together, singing and dancing, working in fields, all the kind of stuff, that you also associate with sort of Stalin's Russia. It was only later that it became more hard-edged. So it seems to me there's, again, some sort of parallel. I know we're not allowed to make analogies between fascism and what is going on now, but I'm going to anyway, so I don't care. Tell me again if you think I'm being shrill or over the top.
No, unfortunately I don't. I think you're being pretty reasonable. You're right. This is... Well, you can see that kind of trajectory even with this ongoing movement, because at the beginning it was all about, okay, let's have a sense of pride, let's celebrate our unique identities and all the rest of it. But now it's very much entered into the stage of policing what other people are doing. There's a reason that myself and others who speak out against these topics on social media get death threats from these individuals. I've been threatened with being reported to the police on God knows how many occasions simply for daring to state biological facts. Last year's conference run by the LGB Alliance, a number of activists came in and let off boxes of cockroaches there to try and disrupt the conference and shut it down.
That's incredible.
It's just utterly shocking stuff. So it's no longer about just please leave us alone and let us live our lives as we want. It's we're going to dictate to you how you must live your lives, and if you dare to do anything other than that, well, we're going to cause as much disruption and mayhem as possible.
Psychotherapy, which is obviously your area of expertise, like all other spheres of sort of UK life, appears to have been sort of institutionally captured, like a lot of other areas of national existence, by these. We might come on later to try to understand what the ideology underlying this is, but let us call it for the time being kind of new left, postmodern influenced thought. You wrote recently for Matt Goodwin's Substack about how the British Psychological Society seems to have adopted critical race theory and sort of anti-whiteness. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, this stuff is so deeply embedded in that organisation. Some whistleblowers got in touch. They were concerned about the way that the organisation was heading. They sent me through various internal communications, research papers, internal training sessions. It was really quite concerning. It was actually one of the worst collectively in terms of what I've come across, and I get sent a lot of stuff. Papers called The Trojan Horse of Whiteness. Training materials for first-year psychology students, teaching them about white fragility and anti-whiteness. Specifically hiring trainee psychologists who are willing to practice within a quote-unquote anti-whiteness framework. There was even a webinar that I attended in which some of the senior leaders in the British Psychological Society said that in order for white colleagues to truly demonstrate that they are anti-racist, they might need to be prepared to give up their jobs and salaries to allow black and other ethnic minority colleagues to take their place instead. I cannot fathom that such regressive racist, I'm going to call it, actually. It's funny because they say they're anti-racist. I'd say they're racist. It's been pushed from an organisation that has such a huge amount of power and clout in society, because they are responsible for the psychological well-being, essentially, of a nation.
Yeah, I interviewed an NHS nurse called Amy Gallagher about 2 or 3 years ago, and she was training, as you were indeed, part-time to become a psychotherapist, and she was training at the Tavistock, the infamous Tavistock clinic, in the evening. And she wasn't at that point a political person. She'd never heard of critical race theory, but she said most of the lectures were about white privilege and all this kind of stuff. And she was bemused as to how the things she was being taught should actually be applied in a real therapeutic session, a one-on-one session with a patient. And so she innocently started asking questions about this. And for whatever reason, the Tavistock didn't really want to give her very clear answers. And she was suspended from her course. She was told that she presented a safeguarding threat to the other students, so she wouldn't be able to actually attend the lectures in person. I mean, this stuff has a sort of nightmarish political science fiction movie type quality to it. And she was eventually booted off the course totally, and lost all the money she had handed over to them over rather like you, I think a sort of 2 or 3 year period. This is truly bizarre, and perhaps you could tell us, your own particular story about your own involvement with the Metanoia Institute.
Mark, the lunatics are running the asylum. These people who are meant to be responsible for upholding good mental health are in fact encouraging delusion, fragility, victimhood, polarization. Yes, my experience not dissimilar to that of Amy's. In the middle of a master's degree in psychotherapy, concerned on the critical race theory, but predominantly the gender ideology, felt that it flew in the face of ethics in terms of open exploration, the Hippocratic Oath and such like, and not encouraging or affirming delusional thinking in clients or patients. I mean, for me, that was a kind of foundation stone of psychotherapy. Began to speak out against the government's plans to ban conversion therapy, which I know we're going to talk about in a bit. And I received an email out of the blue one day telling me that I was summarily expelled with no evidence and no hearing and no appeal. And I spent 3 years fighting litigation, which only a few months ago settled out of court. I was suing both them and the UK Council for Psychotherapy, which is one of the main regulatory bodies for psychotherapists. So I've been vindicated after a long and very expensive journey that I was only able to go on because of the generosity of complete strangers who helped me to crowdfund for this. So, you know, I've received justice to some extent, but I am contacted frequently by trainee psychotherapists on courses across the country, and even some tutors on some of these courses who are so deeply concerned about what's being pushed in these institutions, but are too afraid to speak out because they're worried the exact same thing is going to happen to them.
Perhaps you could say something about the contradiction that I see as a complete outsider to this world between traditional theories of psychotherapy, which seem to me very individually based or individual orientated. They're about presumably trying to analyze why the client has a specific set of problems or is unhappy, depressed generally, and what are the specific solutions to that very personal situation, compared with a type of psychotherapy which is fused now with an ideology that says we exist as part of oppressive social structures, that social forces determine who we are, and that the solution to various mental health disorders is in some way political. It requires massive cultural change rather than assisting an individual to change. It seems to me that they're sort of incompatible, these two approaches. Am I right? Or?
Fundamentally incompatible. If you think about what the bedrocks of psychotherapy are, empathy, you know, trying to actually put yourself into someone else's shoes, curiosity, and not making assumptions, not jumping to conclusions, not stereotyping. As you said, very much individualistic. Therapists should be curious about the journey, the story of the person that sat opposite them, and not pretend that they know the answers or they know that person's experience. Even things like bracketing and trying to avoid things like projection, which is that a therapist might see a part of themselves or think they see a part of themselves in a client. They shouldn't assume that just because themselves and a client share a trait that they have anything in common, because otherwise you end up essentially becoming enmeshed with your clients. You need to keep that kind of distance. So this notion that you can tell all about somebody and what they've been through in life, good or bad, because of, for example, their skin colour or their religion, flies in the face of that. And I've spoken to clients who've come to see me whose previous therapist, I spoke to one client in particular, which really sticks with me, straight white man, that evil creation that society seems to be against these days, straight white man, and essentially he went to therapy because he was struggling with some things at work, with his family life, and his therapist essentially told him that he had privilege, white privilege, and therefore he should consider and check that privilege before he feels too down about other areas of his life in which he was struggling. I mean, that is shaming a client and essentially telling them that he's got nothing to complain about because he's white. Similarly, on my training course, we were told that if you are a white practitioner and you have a black client that comes to see you, you need to bring the racial difference into the room. You actually need to proactively bring it up and ask that client, okay, so I noticed that we've got different skin colours. I'm wondering how that makes you feel. Almost trying to invite in some sort of discussion about power imbalance, as if the fact that you're white and they're black means that this is kind of modern day colonialisation. I mean, it's like utter madness, very affronting and insulting to a lot of clients as well, because it's, again, making assumptions about them. So it flies in the face of therapeutic ethics, but it's exactly what's being taught to students under this banner of DEI.
So the therapist, according to this sort of new left approach, really becomes a political activist, because their job is not to help the individual get out of the rut they're in and to have a happier life personally. It is to identify the patient as on the basis of a characteristic, as a sort of avatar for an entire group. So I suppose with gender dysphoria, this means presumably saying to somebody who is suffering from that, actually, it's not really about you. You don't need to change anything. Society is the problem. Heteronormativity, we need to get rid of that. And so you're kind of recruiting, in a rather sinister way, that person to become implicitly, if not explicitly, part of a wider political cultural movement. Is that a way of summing it up?
It would be no different to a client who engages, because of whatever mental health condition they've got, in kind of delusional thinking around who they are. I mean, some people believe that the Messiah, if they're in a kind of state of mania, people with bipolar disorder might believe that the Messiah, for example, would be no different to the therapist essentially affirming that notion, maybe even bowing down to them and saying, yes, my lord, and then essentially suggesting that it's the rest of society that needs to get on board with this notion that they could well be the Messiah. It's no different. Again, it's affirming things that are simply objectively false. And it's not kind, but it's also not therapeutically ethical. But politics has been brought more and more into the space of psychotherapy. Even if I think to one of the previous therapists I saw, and we had a good therapeutic relationship, and I actually respect her a lot, but this demonstrates how much this has seeped in. We were discussing, I think I was discussing my frustration with society and the fact that I felt judged for some of my political opinions. I think I dared to say that I respected Nigel Farage. This is a number of years ago. And my therapist was pretty stony-faced in the moment, but the next week came back and said to me, James, I've been reflecting on it, and when you said that you respected Nigel Farage, I felt quite impacted by that. And I'm not sure whether we can continue therapy together. And thankfully I was kind of resilient enough to take it. But this is somebody I'd spent years kind of pouring my heart and soul out to, and essentially I was being rejected, turned away because we have different political opinions. I mean, for some clients in a vulnerable state, if their therapist who they trust turns around and says something like that, it could be utterly devastating for them. Now, she did subsequently reflect further and then apologise, and we were able to kind of work through it, which was fine. But I think that story in and of itself demonstrates the way in which politics has entered the therapeutic space. I mentioned earlier this term bracketing. It's the notion that it doesn't matter whether you agree with what your clients are saying or doing. It doesn't matter what your own personal beliefs or opinions are on the material that they're bringing to sessions. You try and bracket your own personal beliefs, and you try and see them through the lens of what can I do to help this person as their practitioner, not trying to impose your political beliefs on them or judge them because they've got differing political beliefs to you. So this stuff is everywhere, and as I said, I've been on the receiving end of it.
What seems to be the sort of common denominator across all these different areas of life is that the whole idea of a sort of self-denying ordinance, which a liberal democracy depends upon. Individual police officers will have personal political views, but their job when they're in uniform is to enforce the law in a completely impartial way. Academics at one time were thought to be people who would present or should present their students with different perspectives on, some historical event or whatever it was they were teaching them. All of that seems to be, as with your particular experience of psychotherapy as a client, seems to be going out the window, so that everything is becoming politicized in a partisan way. And once that process starts, then you really are on the road to a totalitarian society. So the atmospherics at the moment don't seem to be, hugely authoritarian generally, unless you come up against this sort of stuff. But actually what we might be seeing is the beginning of a transition from a functioning civilized liberal democracy, which I think we were on balance until about 20 years ago or so, to something actually much darker, much more sinister.
And it's one rule for one and another for another. I often get sent by whistleblowers materials, recordings from inside their organisation or company, and you'll see senior leaders almost ranting to staff members about their own kind of subjective political opinions, almost operating under the assumption that everyone in the organisation must feel the same way that they do, and if they don't, that maybe they're out of step with the culture of that organisation. So quite happy to put forward their own subjective personal beliefs in one way, but if you dare to go against the grain, if you dare to say something that isn't in line with that organisation's culture, then they will quickly sort you out and try and attempt to shut you down. I mean, I was working in the Home Office up until not so long ago, and for some tweets that I put out in my personal name, in my personal life, predominantly criticising Keir Starmer for saying that women can have a penis, I was hauled through a disciplinary process, and I was told that even though I wasn't identifying myself as a civil servant, even though I was doing it in my spare time, that this in some way flew against ethics and neutrality. Okay. The person who instigated the disciplinary process against me, my manager, in her work email signature, specifically had a line saying, "I'm an LGBTQ+ ally," with pronouns and a rainbow flag after it. And I turned around and said, if I'm not allowed to post things in my personal time on my Twitter account, why is a senior leader allowed to put some ideological marker in her workplace signature? One rule for one and another for another.
Yes, and it goes back to the point that weirdly, and that's part of its genius, I guess, this is perceived as a sort of form of common sense. It's in some way beyond political difference. I guess maybe Christianity in this country in the late 19th century would have been perceived in these sort of terms. I mean, even then, people who weren't Christians or were adherents of different religions would have had almost total freedom of expression in regards to religion. I don't know if you could have got sacked from the civil service for saying something non-Christian or Christian critical then. But we are seeing this sort of transition, no pun intended again, to a very different type of society, which is not really compatible with liberal pluralism. Well, clearly not. But somehow it gets away with it because it's not presented as an overt ideology in the same way that fascism and communism took ownership of their illiberal agendas.
Yeah. Well, it's not, because of how it's happened, and which is mostly kind of at a low level, subtly under the surface. I speak to a lot of people who actually say it feels like they just blinked their eyes and woke up and all of a sudden this stuff was here. It didn't feel like there was some sort of overt regime change or some particular agenda being pushed. That's, again, I have to compliment them. The people who have been pushing these insidious ideologies, and society has done a very good job of doing it, because they've managed to kind of infiltrate the social fabric, even just our lexicon and the language that we use. I mean, I often say to people, if you're looking at a bar menu for cocktails and there's a G and blank, your brain automatically fills in the T at the end. I mean, it's so natural to us. Or if you're looking at a sandwich shop and it's a BL blank, again, you fill in the T. Not dissimilar with LGB blank. Anyone could tell you. You ask a random person on the street, they will know that a T follows that. Because why? Because it's everywhere. It's in our public policies. It's in our institutional guidelines. It's on TV and in advertising. It's in the public corporations and the kind of advertising they're putting out there. It's like we can recite some of these mantras in our sleep if we want. Trans women are women. It's like it's they've been pushing at it for so long that now it would seem almost bizarre. I mean, I'm one of the people calling for the T to be separated from the LGB, but actually, I mean, it would feel very, very odd, because we're so used to seeing those four letters put together. So I just use that as one example of the way in which that they've been very, very clever about this whole thing. Linked with what we were saying earlier about this notion of being kind, not wanting to be racist, not wanting to be a transphobic bigot and all the rest of it. And what you create is a culture in which it's utterly normalised, and also people have the absolute fear of God put into them if they dare to speak out against it.
And it's in all contexts. I mean, my local Westminster City Council run library is just completely festooned with flags and posters and book displays about, pride or trans. I've registered a complaint, and I've said that these are political insignia, symbols, and they said, well, no, they're not, and the council doesn't define them as such. So why does my library have all this stuff? I have to contribute to it as a ratepayer, and I think it's outrageous. I don't want the stuff I believe in either being put in the library. I mean, that's not how our democratic society should operate.
Subconsciously, this will have an impact one way or the other, because it normalises it. When members of the public see police officers, who are the figures of authority in society, dancing at Pride with some drag queens, subconsciously that is going to have an impact on how you're viewing these things. Again, it's all just becoming normalised. When you've got drag queens being invited in to read to school children, for example, it's making it seem like, this is all absolutely fine. There's nothing to see here. This is just the way society has become now. It's really, really quite bizarre. It does make you doubt yourself sometimes. I mean, I've seen NHS guidance suggesting that men can have periods, and I've been thinking about it, Mark, because
you've triggered me.
I mean, maybe this is too personal to share with you, but I've not had a period yet, and so I'm now starting to think whether I could be pregnant. I mean, it's like you start to doubt everything that you ever thought was real. I've spoken to men who have gone for scans in the local hospital, and they're being told they must answer a question as to whether they could be pregnant or not. And if they don't answer the question one way or the other, they're refused the scan. It's suggesting to patients that, men can get pregnant.
Yeah, I was asked when I went to register with my stepmother the death of my father a few years ago. The person who we were having to fill out the form with in Camden Council said, and she was obviously embarrassed by it, she said, I'm afraid I have to ask you a very personal question now. And we were thinking, what could it be? And she said, your father, who was 87 when he died, did he still identify as a male at the time of his death? The notion my father on his deathbed would have sort of converted to being a woman, or maybe gender fluid or something. It was such a hilarious thought that we both burst into laughter, and she was kind of relieved that we didn't find the question, offensive. But it is part of the way in which all the sort of signposts to objective truth and reality are actually being removed. Which leads me on to ask you about the relationship between transgender ideology and queer theory. It seems to me that sort of queer theory is the sort of military provisional wing of the trans movement, if you can make an analogy, sets of ideas rather than organisations. But do you see what I'm saying? I mean, you mentioned drag queen story time. This whole notion of queering is, I think, a very interesting one, which seems hilariously ridiculous to a lot of people, but actually, I think it's the cutting edge of a revolutionary movement.
I think so as well, and I think it's leading to perversion, and I think it's leading to delusion, and I think it's leading to discrimination, the very things it's supposedly fighting against. I mean, I spoke at the Battle of Ideas last year, and the entire theme of my talk was that queer theory, in my eyes, needs to be eradicated. And I use that word very intentionally. And it's all of those letters at the end of that LGBT acronym that we should be worried about, because often now it's LGBTQ+, and people don't really think what's behind the plus. But there's a lot of very worrying ideologies and perversions behind there. I've come across materials where people are trying to essentially justify and encourage paedophilia. You know, they say, oh, these people are just attracted to children. I publicised a book recently it was published in the UK. I think it was one of the main university publishers. It's stocked in Waterstones, and it's essentially from an academic who is trying to normalise bestiality and describe it as a form of love between animals and humans, and that we need to bring it in.
Well, love is love, after all. I mean, the posters do tell us that. So
oh, of course.
I think you should really go along with it.
Quite possibly so. And we're told that, well, yes, you might say that pets cannot consent to you having sex with them, but then again, they can consent to you keeping them as pets in the first place. So therefore, you know, this is the kind of logic that they try and utilise. Yeah, the fact there's books in our mainstream booksellers essentially trying to normalise bestiality is quite concerning. Just a few other examples of kind of queering that I've come across. Ecosexuality, people who enjoy having sex with trees. What else? Queering atrocity prevention. That's a new one. So
you're going to have to explain that. You can't just let that one hang, I'm afraid.
This was actually put forward by the Biden administration. Some of the senior figures within that administration tried to suggest that possibly the invasion of Ukraine would not have happened were queer theory and culture more deeply embedded across the international stage.
I'm sure that would have had a huge influence on Mr. Putin. But that's an interesting example, because here on the one hand you have dear old Sleepy Joe Biden, who comes across as a very respectable senior statesman of the Anglosphere, centre-left, you know, very moderate. And yet, even he, like Starmer, who's a sort of British equivalent, just sort of goes along with this stuff. So, for example, in a British context, this government is committed, it's I think a manifesto commitment, to introducing a law, which I think Boris originally was wanting to pass, and I know you were involved in the opposition to it, so that the Conservatives never got round to it. But this government certainly, I think, is going to ban what they call LGBT plus conversion therapy. Again, this is all, it seems to me, part of the whole queering agenda, because it's designed to stop people challenging the idea that somebody should engage in an incredible act in terms of declaring there's something they're not, and maybe even taking that further, taking puberty blockers, having in inverted commas, sex change operation. So they're trying to stop people, including therapists, I assume, from blocking that state of consciousness.
Yes, this legislation would introduce formally into our legislative framework the notion of gender identity, which in and of itself I'm very concerned about. Again, it's kind of giving credence to this notion that we all have this unique identity. And again, it further dilutes the notion of sex. But this legislation, and we've seen it passed abroad, and often the legislation that's passed is kind of cookie cutter, copy and paste jobs from one jurisdiction to the next. They're kind of all just feeding off each other. And essentially, it is likely to end up criminalising therapists who do anything other than affirm clients, including children, to transition. It could well criminalise parents who don't go along with this narrative either. There was similar legislation passed in Victoria in Australia, and the Victorian Human Rights Commission said that if parents do not support their child's desire to take puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, the parents might be guilty of the offence of conversion therapy for trying to block them. It will also risk criminalising conversations in a religious context between religious leaders and their congregation. So it's really quite concerning. What it doesn't do is tackle the real conversion therapy going on in society, which is the individuals and institutions who are pushing this narrative on children that it is possible to be born in the wrong body. And young girls are being told that if they like the colour blue and playing football with the boys and want to have shorter hair, then that might be because they are actually a boy trapped in a girl's body. That's the real conversion therapy. The organisations like Stonewall and Mermaids, who are happy to send out breast binders in the post behind parents' backs and encourage this dysphoria and disease in their bodies, that's conversion therapy. But our government are not interested in dealing with that. They're trying to tackle the therapists and the parents who are concerned about the well-being of vulnerable children and stop them making irreversible decisions that they will regret for the rest of their lives.
And yet when you bring this up, I mean, I was part of a debate with Helen Joyce against Peter Tatchell and Frida Wallace last year. When you say this, people like Peter Tatchell, who's somebody I, respect and like in a broader context, but nevertheless, he told me I was, in front of the audience, I was scaremongering, it was completely untrue, that this would have no effect on psychotherapists and parents. So I said, well, who's this legislation aimed at then? If you try and ask the people who are behind this, like Alicia Kearns, or Caroline Noakes, or Theresa May, all the kind of people who really support this stuff, they say, oh, you're scaremongering. Well, so why have this legislation in the first place? It's illegal as it is to force somebody off the street, tie them into a chair and harangue them and tell them, they mustn't be gay, or they must desist from affirming they're trans. That's against the Public Order Act. You can't force somebody to have a conversation with you against your will, as it is. But they will never then, when you raise this, they say you're scaremongering. But Annalise Dodds, when she was I think Equalities Shadow Minister for Labour, she said there's going to be no loopholes. This will apply to all adults. They won't be allowed to do anything other than affirm in a private consenting conversation that somebody is quite legitimate. I suppose it would be like passing a law saying if somebody, I don't know, had anorexia. I mean, supposing you were dealing with a client, I don't know, who had anorexia, and you weren't allowed to say, actually, I think this isn't probably the best course of action for you. And then you could be sent to jail for saying that.
Yes, it would essentially dictate that a therapist refers to an anorexic person as fatty because that's what they consider themselves to be. And you're not there to challenge them on that. So you have to go along with it. If they think they're fat, yes, they are indeed fat. As I said earlier, if they think they're the Messiah, yes, why not? Yes, they're the Messiah. You mentioned Annalise Dodds. Just as an aside, I just saw before I came in here today that today she's resigned her various minister roles. She under Starmer, she took up the role of Minister of Women and Equalities. It'll be interesting to see if Keir Starmer appoints somebody to the role who actually knows what a woman is. That's just a mad thought I've got, but let's see if he takes that on board. But yes, I mean, the risks of the chilling effect this will have on the profession are stark. I mean, I work with clients who believe that they're transgender. That includes adults and teenagers. And I practice in an ethical way, which is explorative. I don't tell them what to do or what to think, but I explore causation. I consider other contributing factors, other comorbidities that might have been present in their life. I look at risks associated with paths they want to go down. I challenge forms of thinking that are inconsistent or lacking in logic. I consider various options, including the option, God forbid, of them learning to accept themselves and settle into their bodies, rather than feeling the need to take irreversible hormones and go under the knife. That's how I practice. And I genuinely fear that if this legislation is passed, I could find myself hauled in before a court, charged with being a conversion therapist. And I've got countless other colleagues who fear the exact same. And you'll end up just having therapists, ethical therapists, too afraid to work with these clients, and all we'll be left with are the ghouls who essentially want to affirm this notion and encourage as many kids as possible to transition. That's all we'll be left with. So I'm really very concerned about this legislation. They've doubled down on it. They seem to be suggesting they're going ahead with it. I'll do whatever I can in my power to stop this from happening.
Well, you've been a fantastic lodestar trailblazer in this area, because you had the courage to take on an institution from within, and you had to pay the price, and that you were prevented from qualifying as a psychotherapist, which was obviously something you really wanted to do. I mean, is this something you're hoping to do? Are you allowed to practice at the what's the situation with regards to your own life at the moment in relation to this?
I'm doing it again, Mark, and I'm very pleased to be doing it again. I just a few months ago I set up an organisation called Just Therapy, which is essentially a directory of therapists who are aligned by the same principles: neutrality, non-judgment, free from identity politics, and encouraging things like free speech and resilience over victimhood and fragility. So I've got about 70 or 80 colleagues, and I've set up a private practice, which is basically full at the moment, and I'm very pleased to be working with people again. And it's what I love doing. I feared at one point I wouldn't be able to do it again, so I'm very happy to be doing it. I've chosen not to be accredited with any of the with any of the therapeutic bodies, because, as was alluded to earlier, they're all as bad as each other. They've all bought into these ideological narratives hook, line and sinker, and I don't want to have to adhere to their policies, which I believe will damage my clients' well-being if I go along with them. So I'm out on my own, and I'm quite happy to do so. And I encourage other therapists who feel the same way to kind of come on board and join us, right? Because there's strength in numbers, and I want to show the public. A lot of the clients that come to see me, they say they don't trust therapists. They're concerned that therapists, particularly for the children, are going to try and put ideas into their head. And I want to try and demonstrate that there are still some ethical therapists left out there.
So you're very much, I mean, it's great news that you're doing this. So you're very much part of the fight back, which is now very apparent. I mean, we're still up against, hugely powerful forces, because they still control all areas of the public sector and a lot of big business. But nevertheless, there's clearly a movement developing. Before I ask you my last question, you mentioned, you hope that stick a Keir Starmer. That was a spoonerism, or potential spoonerism. Was going to appoint a successor to Annalise Dodds, who knew what a woman was. Well, he's recently appointed a health minister who believes that if somebody identifies as a llama, that must be treated with great respect. So I wouldn't, hold out too much hope. But my last question is, if you were to find yourself as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and if you were to have the same kind of executive power that Donald Trump was able to exercise on day one of his new presidency, what would be the law or the institution you would abolish or amend, or indeed would you want to impose something completely new?
I mean, I've got a lot of thoughts beyond the realms that we've been talking about. I'd be seeking to leave the ECHR, for example. But aside from that, in this space, I'd be repealing the Gender Recognition Act, because it creates this fallacy that there is some sort of notion of legal sex over biological sex. I would be pulling the plug on this conversion therapy ban. I would be I would be permanently banning puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, not just what the government has done, which is essentially fudge it, because they're still planning on running clinical trials for vulnerable children, giving unlimited kids puberty blockers, which I'm very concerned about. In fact, I might, if they push forward with this, I might be seeking to take a judicial review against the government along with Keira Bell. So that's kind of in the pipeline. So I would put permanent bans on those. I would make it a criminal offence, a new criminal offence, to carry out any form of quote-unquote sex reassignment surgery, essentially equating it with grievous bodily harm, which is what it is for a mental health condition. I would be unilaterally banning men from women's spaces and sports. I mean, and much more on top of that.
Wow. Well, you've massively cheated, because you're only meant to have one. You're more like the Argentinian president, Mr. Milei, when I don't know if you saw him when he was sort of tearing signs off walls which represented the various government departments he was about to abolish. So, but we'll let you get away with it, because you've been a fantastic guest, and thank you so much for talking to us about this incredibly important area of public life. Thanks,
Mark.